George and Herman Brown of the Brown and Root Construction Company. Johnson helped the Brown brothers build a billion-dollar construction empire. In turn, the Browns would fund Johnson's political campaigns.
Judgmentally, what I'd say is that they were a couple of guys who were making a lot of money out of the New Deal, and they didn't want to have to pay higher wage rates, so they were against the unions. It wasn't a matter of high principle. They wanted to get rich, and they did get rich. Well, Lyndon sidled up to them, or they sidled up to him, and they made book. I remember asking Johnson once in the White House, did you deal with cash? And he said it was all cash. I mean, there were no records. So in those circumstances, there were plenty of politicians who were selling out to business interests. I use a pejorative term. I don't know what other term to use. I mean, in TV, you have to use some shorthand. I mean, they were agreeing to be with those people in exchange for money, which they used in their campaigns. That's pretty close to selling out, isn't it? And everything is organized not like his father around ideas and ideals, but like the son around himself and his own career. Not to say that he is not therefore doing a lot of good. He brings real electricity to people that don't have it in his own district. Yeah, sure, he's really smart.
On May 2nd, 1939, George Brown wrote Johnson a letter. I hope you know, Lyndon, how I feel in reference to what you've done for me, and I'm going to try to show my appreciation through the years with actions rather than words.
That morning, as Johnson and Kennedy arrived in Dallas, a Maryland insurance agent, Don Reynolds, arrived on Capitol Hill to brief Republican staff members of the Rules Committee. He'd promised proof that the vice president had misused his office for personal gain. He showed the investigators invoices, documents, and diary entries he claimed implicated the vice president.
Don presented a good case. He could back it up. Everything he said he had a receipt for. It's hard to argue with a receipt or a canceled check or an invoice. It's hard to argue with documentation.
At 3:30, Chief Counselor Van Kirk was called out of the deposition to be told Jack Kennedy had been killed, that Lyndon Johnson had been sworn in as the 36th President of the United States.
Reserve, protect, defend, Constitution of the United States. Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
I knew that if I went back in and told Don Reynolds that Lyndon Johnson was the new president and Kennedy was dead, he'd clam up. So I just went back in and said nothing, and we continued the interview for another 2 or 3 hours. And I tried to get every bit of information out of him I could.
The tragedy in Dallas stalled the investigation for a while. Johnson had no idea that as he was being sworn in, Reynolds was handing over evidence the Republicans hoped to use to impeach him. All he knew at that stage was that continuity was essential, that his team should include all the dead president's staff. This included his nemesis, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy.
For many minutes this afternoon, there was nobody actually at the helm of this great republic. The president lay dead of an assassin's bullet. The vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was incommunicado in a hospital suffering from shock. But now, just moments ago, Lyndon B. Johnson has been sworn in as the President of the United States. What is the position that he occupied in terms of his relationship with John F. Kennedy before this act today?
One of the key men in this case is Clint Murchison. Clint Murchison is an oil millionaire, owned 500 companies, but he was primarily an oil millionaire. He also controlled Texas, controlled Johnson. His major means of operating and controlling people and influencing people was a little hotel called the Hotel Del Charro in La Jolla, California. It cost $100 a day in the 50s. And at that hotel, he would invite all these powerful, influential people. Richard Nixon would come there. Key lieutenants of Carlos Marcello, the head of the mafia in New Orleans, used to vacation there. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, used to vacation there. Free. Every summer for 10 summers. Free.
Another Johnson man with close ties to Murchison was a wealthy Texan called D.H. Byrd.
D.H. Byrd was an underboss for Murchison. He was a Del Charo regular. He owned the Texas School Book Depository. He also founded the Civil Air Patrol, which was a kind of military organization, and Lee Harvey Oswald was a member of the Civil Air Patrol. Another associate of Murchison at the time is Bobby Baker. Bobby Baker's in trouble with the scandals, and he was in all kinds of business deals with Murchison, and many of them were illegal. So Murchison was concerned that Baker and that corruption would lead to his door. And maybe not only would Baker go to jail and Lyndon go to jail, but maybe Murchison would go to jail.
Clint Murchison Sr. was one of the wealthiest men in Texas. He was an old-time wildcatter. And he and Sid Richardson had bought the license to run a famous racetrack in California called Del Mar. J. Edgar Hoover spent each August at their racetrack in their box and as their guest in their suite at the hotel there.
Hoover's own snapshots hinted how Murchison, too, indulged Hoover's taste for a one-way bet.
He invested in oil wells, and if the oil well went dry, he got his money back. Before he purchased stock, he wanted to know what the inside information was. He got it, then purchased stock, which is all illegal for any citizen.
And old man Murchison told me that the most important person in the world to be close to was the sheriff, and he owned a piece of Mr. Hoover because he felt by making certain that he had the box on the finish line, paying his hotel bills and his food bills, that he owned a piece of Hoover. No doubt about it. He was immune practically from any federal investigation of any of his activities.
And was Hoover's attitude toward organized crime influenced by the generosity of a Murchison or a Rosenstiel? One day, the gangster Meyer Lansky spoke about his virtual immunity from the FBI.
He says, if you'll note, he says he doesn't go after anybody like Santo, myself, Carlos in Louisiana. He says he doesn't touch any of us.
Santos Trafficante was the mafia chieftain in Tampa. Carlos Marcello was the godfather of New Orleans.
And I said, you mean to tell me that you pay off Hoover? And he said, absolutely not. He wouldn't take a penny in front, especially from a guy like me. And he laughed. I said, well, how do you do it? He says, I know at least a half a dozen of his friends that are friends of mine. And he went like this to show like quotes. He says, and they take pretty good care of me.
But Hoover's gambling and his dubious friendships never tarnished his image. To the public, Hoover was a real-life hero. He and Clyde Tolson were treated like movie stars. The two snappily dressed bachelors were often seen in New York's most fashionable night spots. One of their favorite hangouts was the Stork Club, managed by Sherman Billingsley, who used to place illegal bets for them. It was here one New Year's Eve that Hoover and Tolson betrayed the secret they shared, a secret that could have destroyed Hoover's reputation and his career.
Well, it was a wonderful night at the Stork Club. It was New Year's Eve, 1936. And I was the only woman at the table.
Louisa Stewart, a famous model, and her boyfriend Art Arthur had been invited to join Hoover and Tolson at Walter Winchell's table.
We all had on those crazy hats and the things you blew, and at one point I'm pointing a toy gun at Hoover, who has his hands up. And it was just a great night.
You knew just what I was there for.
It was getting really late, and Hoover was rather annoyed with Clyde. He felt Clyde had had too much to drink. And finally the decision was to go to the Cotton Club up in Harlem.
The only one my arms.
We went in the FBI limousine, and Art and I sat in the back seat, and Clyde and Jedgar, as we called him, sat in the two jump seats. And then I saw that they were holding hands. And I guess he was forgiving him, but I thought it was sort of odd.
Without a love of my own.
I remember the Cotton Club that night very well, because there were a couple there who were black and white dancing together. And that made Hoover furious. And then Clyde, who was still pretty drunk, said, well, he'd like to dance with Hoover, which we all thought was very funny. Well, we left, finally, and in the taxi going home, then Art said to me, it's common knowledge that they're queer, that they're fairies. Those are the terms used in those days. But he said, we don't talk about it.
Whether we like it or not, it's always been true that a public man's private sex life makes him vulnerable. Hoover knew this. He would eventually seek out one of the most distinguished psychiatrists in Washington to ask for advice and help, because he was so terrorized by his own sexuality. What was he, as director of the FBI, to do about these urges that he had?
In Washington, D.C., police detectives were picking up intelligence about Hoover's private life.
Guy Hoddle was a retired or fired agent. He was an alcoholic. And Hoddle would, every time he had a few drinks, he would tell stories about parties that went on in J. Edgar Hoover's house, when that there were sex parties there. No girls. So when you say sex parties, what does that mean if you have no girls?
I remember Ash Resnick at the Caesar's Palace. He used to be the manager of the nightclub there. He told me that Meyer Lansky had some pretty strong evidence that Hoover and Tolson were both homosexuals.
When he was asked what that meant, he said that Lansky had obtained photographs of Hoover in a compromising situation with Clyde Tolson.
One man who actually claims to have seen such photographs is Gordon Novell, a controversial figure with connections to the intelligence community. Novell, who had worked for the White House in the early 1960s, became involved in a complicated legal action which the White House wanted him to pursue, but which Hoover wanted dropped.
So I went to the White House, and the White House sent me to Mr. Angleton, Director of Counterintelligence, CIA. We met in a restaurant, and I told him my problem, and he says, I know what your problem is. He said, you need to tell Mr. Hoover that you've met with me, and that you're not going to dismiss the lawsuit, and that you've seen this. At which point he opened up his briefcase and pulled out a couple of photographs of Mr. Hoover in flagrante delicto, I guess is one way to describe it. Having oral sex.
This testimony does not stand alone. I talked to a former regular officer in the OSS, that's the predecessor of the CIA, who said that after the war, he went to dinner with other OSS American intelligence colleagues, and that after dinner, when over the brandy stage, when conversation turned to the private lives of public people, his host went out of the room and then came back with a photograph. And this was passed around the table, and the photograph showed two men Hoover and Tolson engaged in homosexual activity.
In New Orleans, where the CIA and the Mafia had sometimes collaborated, Mafia Don Carlos Marcello told Gordon Novell that he, too, had seen a photograph.
I had volunteered the information that I had seen a picture of Mr. Hoover in performing oral sex, and he said that he had seen it, too, and that had been used to keep the FBI, but not the Justice Department, off the back of the mob.
Meyer Lansky had some pretty heavy stuff on Hoover, that he was a homosexual, without any question. And he'd shove it to him if he ever had to.
Irving Resnick said Lansky was the guy who controlled the pictures, and he had made his deal with Hoover to lay off. That was the reason that for a long time we had nothing to fear from the FBI.
In the 40s, we hardly touched organized crime because the Bureau did not believe that there was a mafia, or did not allow us to investigate the mafia as such.
For the vital decades of the Mafia's growth, Hoover denied that nationally syndicated organized crime existed and ignored all evidence that it did.
There wasn't one mention of the Mafia. There wasn't one mention of organized crime activities during the training course that I and all other brand new FBI agents went through in Washington. Not one mention of it.
In fact, the Bureau in Washington had no organized crime division. When I went to the supervisor in Seattle and asked why we weren't going after the Mafia, he said, "We don't use that word. Hoover doesn't acknowledge that there's a Mafia."
Mr. Kennedy, do you expect to delve into any particular fields when you take over as Attorney General?
Well, I think that there are a number of different areas and where action is needed. I think that in the field of organized crime, I think it's a very serious situation that's facing the country at the present time.
Before the Kennedys, the mob had literally been getting away with murder.
The glory years for the mob were right after the Second World War, right up to 1960. That was it.
Nick Pileggi has written about the mob for 30 years and was co-author of the movie Goodfellas.
They owned politicians, they owned unions, they could actually socialize. The FBI said they didn't exist. I mean, it was unbelievable, it was glorious.
Now, would you explain what defeating a place means?
Well,
Jack and Robert Kennedy had studied the mob since 1957, when they took the lead on the McClellan Committee's investigation of organized crime and its association with organized labor. They focused on Jimmy Hoffa, president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the largest union in the country. They were quick to clash.
I would like to say, Senator, that if you're trying to penalize the American labor movement for Hoffa, or for your dislike for Hoffa, then spell it out in the law, exempting everybody except Hoffa. Will you please?
Well, we're exempting everyone but racketeers and hoodlums and crooks.
I would like to have you draft that language, sir.
I'm not talking necessarily...
As Attorney General, Robert Kennedy was determined to convert his knowledge of the mob into a new national policy. Don't define it. Do something about it, he told the young lawyers he recruited for this mission. Robert Blakey was one of those lawyers.
You just can't know how inefficient and complicated and inept the government is unless it's held together in some way by the force of somebody's personality. Robert Kennedy had that and did that.
He forced FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to shift manpower and resources away from hunting communists to busting gangsters. He surfaced mob informant Joe Valachi in a nationally televised hearing.
Man, he picks your finger. Who? The Godfather.
He picks your finger.
He picks your finger with a needle. Makes a little blood come out. In other words, that's the express, the blood relation. Supposed to be like brothers.
That's the letting of blood.
That's right.
All of us in that position.
Under Robert Kennedy, successful prosecutions of organized crime figures increased 700%.
By 1963, J. Edgar Hoover was becoming isolated and entrenched within the FBI he had created. Then, just after lunchtime on November 22nd, Hoover called his boss, Bobby Kennedy, to tell him that his brother, the president, had been shot in Dallas.
Got a call from Bobby saying that the president was dead, that he'd gotten a call from Hoover. And Bobby said, I think Hoover enjoyed telling me.
The next day, while most of the United States was reeling with the size of the tragedy, Hoover went to the races. And what work he did in terms of the FBI's follow-up on the assassination, he did on the telephone from his box at the races.
This is Tony Lewis, taping with Bob Kennedy, and why don't we talk now about the relationship with Mr. Hoover and the FBI?
The relationship between Bobby and Hoover could be summarized in a word: blackmail.
Do you now think that Mr. Hoover is a dangerous person, or just nasty?
No, I think he's dangerous.
Did you ever have the feeling that he knew a very great deal about you, personally?
I suppose every month he'd send somebody around to give information on a member of my family or myself, so that it would be clear that he was on top of all of these things and received all of this information. I really deferred to him. I made it real effort because I knew that he didn't like me. He is rather a psycho, and I used to keep his ego up. We used to arrange for him every 2 or 3 months, go over and have lunch alone with the president. I made a fuss over him.